In our previous lecture, we had discussed the background of 19th century ideas of progress, the impact of the dual revolutions in politics and in industry. Today we want to consider in our lecture some omens that were of a darker nature, that promised progress, yes, but did so through conflict. The 19th century had often in its thought emphasized concepts of progress, and there were certainly objective reasons for confidence in the notion of an ever-increasing betterment of the human condition. The confidence rested on things like the growing influence of liberal ideas, such as human rights, toleration, constitutional government, the rule of law, and very real and visible scientific advances which had revolutionized to a great extent in the course of just a generation or two the lives of so many ordinary people in Western civilization. At the same time, and this will form the subject of today's lecture, there were certainly countercurrents in the thought of Western culture in the 19th century, extending into the 20th century, which didn't reject the notion of progress, but explicitly saw conflict, clashes, perhaps war, as the key to advancing progress and to achieving that betterment that was longed for. One enormously influential set of ideas that made conflict a key part of its prescription for the future was the scientific socialism of Marxism. This enormously influential set of ideas of the 19th century was developed by Karl Marx and by his associate, Friedrich Engels. Karl Marx was born in Western Germany. He was a student of philosophy who was unable, after finishing his degree, to find an academic position due to his very fervently held atheism. He instead turned from desires for an academic career to journalism and then to political activism in exile after his radical views had already closed off other career paths of a more conservative sort. Karl Marx announced his doctrines together with his associate Engels in a slim booklet of just a few scant pages in 1848 entitled The Communist Manifesto. This was a small booklet that would affect the lives of literally millions and millions in our own times. Though it expressed in a concentrated and distilled form his analysis of the present day, how we had gotten there, as well as where the world was headed, he continued later to work out in much more detail his theories in a multi-volume masterwork entitled Das Kapital, Capital. Marxism was presented quite consciously as a science of revolution. We need here to think of the ubiquity of evolutionary ideas that had already been propounded by thinkers like Charles Darwin. Marx, one might justifiably say, aimed to do the same for human history, to discern the deeper laws, the deeper dynamics, and to show how these could be mastered. Marx rejected earlier thinkers in the socialist tradition as merely utopian socialists. When Marx used utopian socialists, it was definitely not a compliment. Rather, their plans were based not on material realities, but instead on wishful thinking, on hopes and ideals. Karl Marx stated, by contrast, that his doctrine, a truly scientific socialism, was based in observable realities, empirical truth, and the world as it really was. Marxism soon became influential in part because it brought together so many contemporary concerns: evolution, the high prestige of science, the increasing need to turn towards mass politics for legitimacy. And as a result of bringing together these concerns, it often exercised considerable appeal for contemporaries, because it promised not just an explanation of how the world was, but also seemed to promise the keys to history and to progress. Karl Marx's thought sought to overturn the thought of the German philosopher Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel, a brand of thought known as idealism, which had argued that ideas, concepts, were a truer reality than their expression in the physical world. Karl Marx was proud of, as it were, turning Hegel, his teacher, on his head. Marx stated that ideas were not the basis of reality, but rather observable matter. Reality changed and evolved, and it did so in material terms. Hence, Marx's doctrine was based on what was called a historical, or sometimes dialectical, materialism. It saw human reality as at base economic and evolving through clashes and changes. Marxism, thus, presented much more than just a description of how the physical world worked in the present day. It also presented, and I think this was one of the reasons for its significant influence and appeal, it presented a dynamic and dramatic vision of history. Marxism presented a tableau, a dramatic narrative of progress, with starring roles played by toiling masses, the machines of the Industrial Revolution, and these impersonal economic forces. Isolated individuals, ordinary people by contrast, not in the aggregate, not in masses or crowds, by contrast played less of a role in Marx's vision of history. And when you came right down to it, his vision of history was a history of class conflict. Class conflict was the key to understanding historical development. Through the clashes of groups in society, whose identities were determined by the economic realities of the day, society passed through different modes of social organization, different modes of production that brought humanity forward in a historical progression that had a beginning, a middle, and an end. This progression seemed orderly. Slavery had been the mode of production of prehistoric times. In medieval times, feudalism had become dominant. Mankind now had reached the stage of capitalism, which was an exciting time to be alive because in Marx's analysis, this was the penultimate, next to last stage of world history. What would follow after this would be the opening of a new epoch. Within the period of capitalism, in which Marx argued his contemporaries now stood, one saw a confrontation of classes and class conflict between, on the one hand, the working class, or the proletariat, as they were called, borrowing a term from classical Roman times for the poor who had literally nothing to sell, no reserves to draw upon except the sweat of their brow and their muscle power, who confronted a powerful group, the bourgeoisie, the owning class, the middle class, who owned the means of production, the factories, the mines, and whose interests conflicted directly with those of the exploited proletariat. For Marx, in this drama of historical progression, the growing misery of the proletariat would eventually drive it, inevitably, by force of scientific deduction, to revolution. This was a process that was perhaps a little bit ponderously described in German as Verelendung. In English, it's rendered even more clumsily as immiserization. It simply means the growing misery of the working classes. And this was a very important part of the driving force that would bring about a great historical change. It was key to Marx's ideas. Someday, probably very soon, after an international workers' revolution, Marx believed the end of history would finally have arrived. Marx called this stage the dictatorship of the proletariat, in which the victorious working class, after having thrown over and dethroned the dominant classes, would itself seize state power, and after a brief period of exercising, perhaps in a despotic way, that state power would change society forever. Class distinctions would be abolished, private property would be abolished, humanity would find itself placed on a basis no longer of the exploitation of man by man, of classes by classes, but on a basis of equality. The state was to wither away, leaving a perfected classless society, free of that divisive force of private property. Equal individuals would now, in this blessed state, find fulfillment in work. One could perhaps go fishing in the morning, lecture in the early afternoon, and then work in the fields in the evening. It was hoped that in this future society, according to the slogan of the communists, one would take from each according to his ability and give to each according to his need, a formula quite different from the world that Marx saw around himself in the age of capitalism. Now, it was precisely at this point in his analysis that Marx's prescriptions grew vague. The state would wither away, society would be reformed on a new basis. When Marx was criticized for the vagueness of these prescriptions, he answered sternly. He was not in the business of writing utopian socialist cookbooks, as the earlier utopian socialists might have been. He was interested in showing the path in a rigorous scientific way to what the future would hold. And it's remarkable to observe that the vague outlines of Marx's prescriptions for the future did not detract from the appeal of his program, precisely because it promised a rigorous plan for achieving that future, whatever its detailed outlines might be. We need next to consider the movement, the political mobilization that grew out of this, to many people, inspiring vision of what the future would hold. Marx threw himself into political activism, often supported by his associate Friedrich Engels. It needs to be stressed that Marx himself was politically active. You still hear it now and again bandied about that Marx was merely a philosopher who had proposed some abstract ideas for us to toy with, and that he would have been horrified to see them actually perhaps put into action. This couldn't be more incorrect. Marx had explained that earlier philosophers had described the world. Now it was the task of people like himself to change the world, and he set about doing that energetically. As part and parcel of this political engagement, Marx had already written himself, in a sense, into his political program. With people like himself in mind, as he was writing the Communist Manifesto in 1848, he had stated that certain exceptional individuals of tremendous philosophical insight might be able to rise above their class origins, in the case of Marx, and middle-class origins, to survey and understand the historical process as a whole, transcending their origins, understanding and influencing the historical process. Karl Marx saw himself as one such philosopher who had changed the world. The most advanced activists in those supporting Marx's ideas were called communists. Marxists lived lives that were made electric, one might say, by the expectation of the approaching final struggle. This was an expectation which was summed up in the international anthem of the communist movement. Note, not the national anthem, but the international anthem. Marx and his associates felt that nationalism was merely a fraud perpetrated by the middle classes upon the working classes, who instead should stand together in class solidarity. This international anthem was, appropriately enough, called the Internationale. The Internationale urged the toiling masses to hear the signal of the approaching final fight. There was almost a religious, apocalyptic promise being made here. A final fight in which slaves would cease to be slaves and would instead become armies of workers who would throw off tyranny and usher in a new age. No gods, no kings could do this for the masses. The masses would have to do it for themselves, as the ringing words of the Internationale announced. It wasn't necessarily a very good sign for the future of the movement that no sooner had this stirring international anthem been produced than its creators were embroiled in a decades-long struggle over the copyright ownership of the Internationale. This is something that didn't really mesh with the abolition of private property announced in that anthem. But we need to focus on this, the certainty on the part of followers of Marx of having understood history's evolution and its ultimate goal gave immense confidence and a sense of purpose to those who followed these prescriptions. When Marx died in 1883, expecting the near advent of the realization of his predictions, he was hailed as a Darwin of politics. If Darwin had made clear to us the underlying laws of the natural world and its changes, so Marx had given order and scientific basis to an understanding of human society. But even at this period, at Marx's death in 1883, in spite of his prediction of imminent revolution, there were already trends afoot that would have disturbed Marx, and which in many ways conflicted with some of his predictions. The socialist parties that were established in European countries, drawing on Marx's thought, tended to be organized on a national basis, with a French and a German and a British socialist movement. They, rhetorically at least, had announced their shared solidarity, but this wasn't necessarily the case if they were organizing on a national basis, something that didn't mesh with the internationalism of Marxist ideology. More disturbing still, these socialist parties all too often tended to grow more moderate over time because they felt, in some cases without even being honest with themselves, but felt in some portion of their political strategizing that Marx's prediction about the inevitable and irresistible worsening of the conditions of the working class environment was not, in fact, taking place uniformly. It seemed, in fact, that the conditions of the lives of workers could be organized and improved not only through violent revolution on a worldwide scale, but in a more ordinary and less dramatic way by efforts to unionize, efforts to press for legislative reforms that would improve those conditions and put them on a more humane scale. However, in spite of their increasingly more moderate organizing activity, the parties nonetheless remained in their rhetoric radically revolutionary. Though they were in practice becoming more moderate, they did succeed, at least in this, in alarming the ruling classes and the middle class, who grew to fear what might happen if the socialists came to power. There was one party in particular that represented the Platonic ideal of what a developed socialist movement should look like in the 19th century, and this was the German Social Democratic Party. The German Social Democratic Party had been founded in 1875. It drew on Marx's ideas and developed into the largest, most comprehensive workers' movement in the world. It was, quite literally, the envy, the object of admiration of socialists worldwide. And there were times, certainly in the United States, where self-respecting radicals would have learned German in order to read in the original the literature of the German Social Democrats. And these Social Democrats seemed to be on their way to power, potentially. By 1912, to the horror of German conservatives and elites, Germany's Social Democratic Party had become the largest party in Germany. It might achieve power by the ballot box. There were, however, and perhaps truer to Marx's revolutionary temperament, more radical socialists who rejected this trend towards moderation and argued that it was necessary to drive forward with more emphasis on conflict and violence. There was also another distinct group which did not share in Marx's prescription for scientific socialism. They would have rejected it as confining, as inauthentic, and Marx would have returned their scorn for what he would have seen as their unrealistic or utopian expectations. These were anarchists. In the course of the close of the 19th century, there was a wave of anarchist actions, attacks, and assassinations which stirred real anxieties in Western civilization from about the 1880s to the early 20th century. These were not coordinated, but they nonetheless were attacks and incidents of terrorism that stirred anxieties that some worldwide unsettling conspiracy was afoot. One needs to take aboard the succession of such events to gain a sense of their cumulative horror to members of settled or ordered societies at the close of the 19th century. The assassination in quick succession of an Austrian empress, a Russian Tsar, the American president, kings of Italy, Serbia, and Portugal, prime ministers of Spain and Russia, and the president of France. And many of these attacks were committed by self-described anarchists. Anarchists, by their very nature, are determined to do away with organized government and thus are quite opposed often to strictly hierarchical and strictly organized movements. Thus, these anarchists suffered from a chronic disorganization. The creed of anarchism that they espoused was not of a peaceful variety. One has certainly such anarchists as well, but rather of a nihilistic variety that pledged to break with human society as it was currently ordered in order to clear the decks, as it were, for a new day. Such anarchists of the nihilistic variety and violent variety followed what they called the philosophy of the bomb. This was not entirely coherent, not entirely thought out, but they hoped that terrorist actions, which they called propaganda of the deed, would have some effect upon the masses, that it would stir them out of their inactivity and towards revolution. Though the attacks that they undertook from the 1880s to the start of the 20th century were not coordinated, they nonetheless stirred anxieties and produced conspiracy theories among the propertied classes and elites, anxious that this might be part of some more disturbing phenomenon worldwide. At the same time, with such conspiracy theorizing, the propertied classes of Europe needn't have looked much further than to their own societies to find a phenomenon of violence that was disturbing in the extreme. And this was the phenomenon called imperialism. In the 1880s and the 1890s, the European powers scrambled in a dramatic grasp after power to grab colonies around the world, in Africa and Asia, literally dividing up continents in a new wave of what's called high imperialism, different from earlier colonialism that had stressed perhaps mercantile objectives or economic aims. Now the goal was to seize territories, to exploit their lands and peoples and their resources. By 1901, most of the world was in the control of Europeans, while even non-European nations like Japan or the United States also sought territories to bring under their sway. A key example of the brutalities of colonial rule was the Central African nation of Belgian Congo, where from 1885, under the rule of a small European power of Belgium, one saw what amounted to a slave state, where the African natives were worked to death in the rubber plantations which sent their funds and their profits to Belgium. This was a regime of such brutality that it horrified even other European imperialists. The death toll of this regime is estimated at around 10 million, which would represent roughly half of the African population of that country. And it saw such horrors as the cutting off of hands of native peoples when they didn't meet their production quotas. It showed the inherent violence in imperialist domination. There was another implication of such imperialist domination, and that was, in addition to the violence we've just mentioned against native peoples, imperialist competition between the imperial powers could also make rival powers more likely to clash, perhaps even within Europe itself. But at the same time, imperialism was cheered by many of its proponents as a progressive and modernizing force. Rudyard Kipling, the British poet, called it the white man's burden, to go out and civilize those whom he called, with imperialist arrogance, half devil and half child. The French spoke of the mission civilisatrice, which was supposed to bring the benefits of French culture, which was equated with civilization as such, to the peoples in French sway. The popular social Darwinist thinking that we've discussed in an earlier lecture saw the races as fundamentally unequal and ranked them into hierarchies of achievement and worth. This ranking made imperialism seem all too natural to contemporaries. Now, imperialism clearly had vigorous critics in Europe whose liberal ideas led them to condemn this phenomenon, but there was, it must be admitted, even more popular support for the drama of colonial conquest. This colonial conquest was fueled and enabled by tools of empire. Technological superiority certainly sped the imperialist drive. Tools of empire included technology like gunboats, tropical medicines, the pith helmet that shielded explorers from the sun, as well as that devastating tool, the machine gun, to be used against natives. The machine gun was demonstrated in its horrific killing capacity at one particular symbolically significant battle. That was the Battle of Omdurman in the Sudan in 1898, in which British colonial forces, far outnumbered by the Sudanese army of rebels, mowed down that army with Maxim guns, in a striking example of the devastating impact of this technology. One young man who was there as an observer, by the name of Winston Churchill, was horrified by the human impact of this killing technology, even on brave Sudanese fighters, and yet he saw this as the onward march of science. Colonial domination also, very importantly, made deliberate use of terror as a tool of domination. Colonial rulers purposefully used tactics of terror in punitive expeditions against native peoples that were, in a cruel twist, euphemistically often called pacification or bringing of peace. The natives' assumed lower status was used to justify strategies of the most intense and horrifying repression, which explicitly would not have been used against fellow Europeans. An example that historians cite of just such a phenomenon is that of the German colonial campaigns against the African people of the Herero in southwest Africa who had risen up in revolt. When their revolt was quelled in 1904, even after it had been crushed, thousands of Herero men, women, and children were deliberately driven into the deserts to die, quite explicitly with the goal of crushing their resistance. Another innovation, a particular institution, which unfortunately would become quite a common sight in the horrors of the 20th century, also had a colonial origin, and that was the institution of concentration camps, as they were euphemistically called. They were established in colonial conflicts. They were used in 1896 in Imperial Spain's attempt to suppress revolt in Cuba. The aim was to cut off guerrillas or fighters in the jungles and in the hills from their support among the civilian population by keeping the civilian population interred in such concentration camps, to concentrate them. The British also used concentration camps in the Boer War at the turn of the century, from 1899 to 1902, in their fight against guerrilla warfare against settlers of Dutch origin in South Africa, which incurred many civilian deaths. These institutions were not yet the sort of places of mass murder that they would become later in the 20th century, but we see here in embryo an institution which later would play a notorious role in 20th century. Such strategies of terror and of measures of control could later be re-imported from the colonial periphery back to Europe, and that certainly would be a case of the empire striking back. Finally, as omens of conflict, there were, on the part of insightful individuals, premonitions, which are often uncanny for us to hear about in retrospect, of an oncoming war, some great collision between the imperialist powers. The start of the century saw almost uncanny instances of the articulation of the possibility of some new, vaster war, whether this was something to be feared or perhaps welcomed. Keen military observers of the American Civil War or of the Russo-Japanese War from 1904 to 1905 had already begun to understand something of the new destructive potential of modern industrial war at its worst. But paradoxically, it was that very destructiveness of modern war that led some of them to argue that such a war would be so devastating, in fact, that war was made less likely. How wrong they were to be. They were also quite in tune with the 19th century's emphasis on progress, its emphasis on hopes for the amelioration of the ills of the human condition, attempts to civilize war itself, how characteristic of the 19th century. These included the Geneva Conventions of 1864 and 1906, the Hague Conventions of 1899 and 1907, all part of a process to codify and establish what now sounds to us like a bitter phrase, rules of civilized warfare, limits to what could be possible in modern conflict. These included attempts to specify sparing of civilians, the protection and civilized treatment of prisoners and the wounded, attempts that turned out not to be very efficient to limit the kinds of modern weaponry that could be used, all in an attempt to tame war and turn it towards the purposes of progress, if not eliminate it altogether. There were certainly other thinkers, however, who saw conflict as a positive good, not merely a necessary ill. Some of them were the followers of the German philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche, who had celebrated irrationality and unreason, the breaking through of traditional moralities in order to prepare the way for the next stage in human evolution, the Superman, who Nietzsche heralded. There were artists like the Italian Futurists who announced themselves bored with the long peace and stability and order of the 19th century, who praised instead, and they meant to shock, and they certainly did, who praised instead speed, danger, and war, as they put it, as a modern hygiene in their manifesto of 1910. They claimed that the museums had to be blown up because they were signs of a dead past. To their mind, they explained, even the most ordinary roaring motor car was more beautiful than an ancient statue because it expressed newness, it expressed energy and vitality and modern technology. There were more sober revolutionaries, moreover, who welcomed the prospect of conflict because of the opportunities it would afford. An example of such a radical revolutionary was the socialist Vladimir Ilyich Lenin, a Russian at this time in exile in Switzerland, who surveyed what he thought might be coming conflict and hoped that such an international conflict could be an opportunity, that it could be turned from a war between nations into an international civil war of classes, leading finally to the successful world revolution. With growing international tension, many political leaders and thinkers began to assume that a great war was likely in the near future. This perhaps would become a self-fulfilling prophecy. And indeed, as we'll see in our next lecture, when the First World War came, it would fulfill the worst of their prophecies and surpass them.